Remember when I made a video about how overpowered Psy is in Blue Lock? Well, it's already outdated, and not because I was wrong. Apparently, I was not glazing him enough, which is honestly weird because this video was made specifically to hype up Psy to no end. However, the writer looked at it and said, "You're not sucking this guy's balls good enough." And so he decided to take things into his hands and introduce new information that shot Psy into the stratosphere in terms of player ranking. And to be honest, this comes as an answer to everyone who said that I was glazing him too much in that video. If anything, I honestly was not glazing him enough. However, what is this new information that we've gotten? You see, there was a new magazine covering a lot of characters from Blue Lock. It covered Isagi, Baro, Shido, and a lot of the important characters. But for the sake of today's video, it mainly covered Psy. However, before we actually get to the information written on him, I gotta give a huge shout out to Iroh Assassin. And for those of you who live under a rock and don't know who this guy is, he is a fellow YouTuber, and I gotta say he is the workhorse of the community. No one is as consistent and works as hard as this guy in the Blue Lock community. And so if you love everything Blue Lock, from news, theories, and chapter reviews, and really like consistency, then Iroh is your guy. However, what does the new information tell us about Psy? Well, first let's start with a statement that I thought to be actually funny. You see, we all know that Psy was scouted by Real, the best club in the world of Blue Lock, at the age of 13. However, apparently he was also scouted to play for Japan's under 20 that same year, meaning at the age of 13, Psy was already called up to represent Japan. That's a feat not even his brother Rin can actually boast about. And this is interesting on two fronts. First, Psy was so OP that they had no issue putting a 13-year-old against 19-year-olds in the same tournament. And secondly, we all were impressed by Loki, Charles, and Nico for playing for the under 20 teams at only 15. With this, Psy completely breaks that limiter and show them how it is really done. It is done at the age of 13. However, on a more serious and a far more important note, the magazine also describes Psy as the world's best U20 midfielder, which at first I read it as if, sure, that makes total sense. I mean, he is definitely better than Hiyori, Charles, or Ness, or honestly, any midfielder we've seen. Holy shit, this includes Hugo. Sure, Hugo is a defensive midfielder, but if Psy is the absolute best midfielder in the entirety of the U20 category, then without a doubt, this means that Psy is actually better than Hugo. And that's specifically where I was mistaken about Psy, because in my matchup of Hugo versus Psy, I clearly said that Hugo definitely had an edge. And at the time, this honestly seemed like the most natural and the most rational results. I mean, Hugo had a much better showing, he plays for a much better team, and he seemed to be very relaxed against a much stronger Blue Lock. But more importantly, he also was comparing himself to fucking Loki. And so I naturally assumed that Hugo definitely is better than Psy. In fact, I even said that it is quite far between the two. And in that video, I said that Bunny is the only player that gets close to Hugo and Loki. And believe me when I tell you guys, at the time this made total sense. I mean, as I just said, Hugo literally had the feats for it, but also he had a massive statement backing this up. But, and of course, and as I've always said, there are levels to what we do. Usually in these matchups, feats are my bread and butter, because typically they are the easiest to verify and the most reliable way to compare any two characters in any given show. However, there is a hidden rule in this realm, which is that feats can never beat statements. Because in order to function, feats need to be interpreted, but on the other hand, statements are taken at face value. And this obviously makes statements far stronger than feats in the realm of comparing characters. And an obvious example of this would forever be the speed of Loki. If we just look at what he can do, then his feat of stopping the Kaiser impact puts his speed at around 120 kilometers per hour, which obviously is just absurd and not even human. However, we then get a statement from Gagamaru saying that Loki's top speed is actually known and it is measured at 38 kilometers per hour, which is still busted but completely within the realm of possibility. And thus, in the same vein, even though Hugo definitely has the feats, this statement flipped things on its head. In fact, there is another level to this, because even within statements there is a hierarchy. Statements made by the characters will forever be inferior to statements made by the writer or made under supervision of the writer. And this is because even though the character statement is usually correct, it is at the end of the day subjective to that character. However, any statement made by the writer or made under his supervision usually has more weight because it carries the vision of the writer for any given character. When a writer tells you that someone is stronger than the other, even if the feats and the character statements don't back it, you gotta believe what the writer tells you, because at the end of the day, he is the one making the rules and he is the one moving the story forward. And thus, for the case of Sai, when we get a clear statement like this, where we get a simple statement as calling him the world's best U20 midfielder, there is literally no wiggle room. Well, there is one, which is actually the fact that this is fan translation, and this matters specifically in regards to Hugo more than anything, because if the official translation instead would say that Sai is the best attacking midfielder or the best cam in the U20 category, then that would immediately make Hugo better, because the fact that it had to specify in order to dodge Hugo would make Hugo better without a doubt. However, as it stands, and from the translation we've gotten, I've even translated this myself, and it says the world's best U20 midfielder, simple as that. Then by definition it includes Hugo and means that Sai is definitely better than him. However, and even though I could end the video here saying that this is where I was mistaken, just talking about Sai versus Hugo, even though it is the most interesting point, is honestly just scratching the surface of what this means in regards to Sai. Because think about it, if Sai is better than Hugo, then how much did we see from him back in the U20 game? I mean, what does this specifically tell us about his performance in that match? Like, I've always thought that he was around 40% and then he jumped into a considerable point after Barrow's goal and Ren going berserk. Obviously, I would not say that he jumped to using 100%, but at least I thought it was close, like 70, maybe even 80. And then him losing to Rin, I thought that maybe he just lost because Sai's strength isn't in his one-on-one, but rather it is into what he gives to the team. However, with this new statement, and with Sai being better than Hugo, this honestly just gets scary, because if Hugo did not go all out against current Blue Lock, the Blue Lock that was playing literally on Kaiser's level, okay, maybe not on Kaiser's level. I feel like maybe only Isagi and Ren were on Kaiser's level. But it doesn't matter, Blue Lock was at least relative to that level, and Hugo literally was not trying. I would say that Hugo was at like 40% of his power, especially towards the end of the game, where he had to try a little bit against Karasu and Isagi. However, if Hugo is at 40% against current Blue Lock that is much stronger, how bad did Sai have it? I almost feel as if he was asleep during that game in order for it to be fair. Like, does this mean that Sai was probably at 10% when he played against Japan? And maybe when he said that he would take the game a level up, maybe he just entered 20%? I don't know, like, shit gets crazy. Especially in regards to Hugo. If Hugo was not taking Blue Lock seriously and Sai is better than him, how much holding back did Sai do back in the U20 game? I'm just frying my brain thinking about this. And this also means that no one truly understood Sai. Even Isagi during the NEL, when he said that he finally kinda gets what Sai was doing, I feel like he was just starting to like enter his 30%, right? However, this also means that Sai choosing Shido was like choosing the best of like the worst outcome. Maybe he chose a character who could deal with Sai at his 20%, right? And I have to remind you that Shido back in the U20 game is the same as Shido in the PXG game. And we know this from the fact that Loki did not teach them shit. And thus, the Shido that was really insane towards the end of the NEL was still nothing to match Sai, which makes Kaiser, Isagi, and even Berserker Rin nothing compared to the real level of Sai. And honestly, that's just scary. And speaking of Berserker Rin, this means that Berserker Rin in the U20 game only beat Sai one-on-one at his 20%. But it kinda makes sense with him seeing his silhouette back in the PXG game, because I feel like Rin might have understood that Sai was holding himself severely in the U20 game, and so he was trying to push himself in order to beat a better Sai. And I would say that him beating Isagi at that level would be around like 40% of Sai, which again explains Sai Sai's interaction with Boratsuta. The reason Sai told him that he can't really join Japan right now because they're simply too weak for him. He would have to hold back in order for them to just understand him. And I feel like he knew they would face France with Hugo and Loki, and he knew that they would be the perfect catalyst in order to push Japan, first to obviously beat Teddy, and second to actually get closer to Sai so he can finally play for real with them. And I feel like my theory that what Ness did at the end of the NEL is already part of Sai's arsenal and the Blue Lockers just did not understand it at the time kinda holds true right now more than anything. I feel like with this we now know that there are a lot of moments where Blue Lock simply just did not understand what even happened for them to understand where Sai stands. So as I just said, with one statement it just gotten very scary, man. And also exciting to be honest, because it means after beating Teddy, we might get the acknowledgements for Sai for the Blue Lockers. Granted, Sai might still not play the first game in the knockout stages and wait until he faces Bunny. And I feel like that would give a little bit more time for the Blue Lockers to catch up to him a little bit. However, speaking of Bunny, this statement also benefits Bunny very much. I mean, the way things are, any statement that makes Sai stronger immediately makes Bunny directly or indirectly stronger as well. And what I'm talking about here is actually the comparison between Bunny and Loki. You see, if Sai is better than Hugo, who considers himself equal to Loki, then by definition both Sai and Bunny, who should be better than Hugo, are actually both on Loki's level. Now obviously something to keep in mind that Sai being better than Hugo could still be very marginal and the difference could honestly be negligible. However, it is still being on his level, meaning they are still being on Loki's level. In fact, the case with Bunny, I think he even rivals him, which is honestly scary. For me, I've always thought that Loki is number 1, Hugo number 2, then Bunny we have number 3. And like Bunny would butter the Blue Lockers towards the real Loki. But no, the writer is not holding back. The Spain game is going to be as intense, if not more intense, than the time they are going to face France in the finals. And honestly, I'm just all for it. Now, you could say that this could make Bunny better than Loki, and I would not actually be against it, contrary to what you might think. I know Loki is hyped up to be like right after Noah, and I feel like Noah did not speak of Bunny, nor did Ego actually target Bunny, but it could be due to Bunny's nasty mentality, and I made a whole video on the killer Bunny and why it is very important for Blue Lock if you wanna watch that. However, another reason into why I am okay with Bunny being actually better than Loki is the fact that we know Loki is a restriction type player. However, he has never been put under restriction once in his life because of his speed. Even against Noah, probably the strongest restriction player, the best striker in the world was not able to steal Loki's freedom all the time. Because of how explosive his speed was, he found himself free multiple times. However, we are not going to see the real Loki until we see him be put under restriction, which could probably happen either in the finals of this World Cups or be saved up to the real World Cups or maybe even the UCL arc. The point is, Bunny could be better right now than Loki, but once Loki awakens and shows his true self, he would obviously be leagues ahead of any U20 player and obviously be better than Bunny. However, as you can see from just one statement, I'm making a lot of theories and I could turn this into a lot of videos. However, I feel like we would do much better job exploring this in a live, and so please watch out for that. However, for now, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed glazing Sai, and until next time, thank you for watching.